All right, hello and welcome to panel session number 3. This is a discussion between local and national experts on what equity looks like in practice when applied to public transit and mobility, transit-oriented communities, and housing. The ways that our transit systems, housing choices, and developments are oriented have a unique ability to shape how neighborhoods and populations are served and if they have the opportunity to thrive. Through these different lenses, our speakers are going to highlight where needs are the greatest and how policy goals and recommendations co-created with communities are a way to deliver equity defined by the very communities that will be impacted. Our 3 panelists today are really, I'm excited to be here with them. I'm almost like a little nervous because they're like rock stars in my book. But our first panelist is Chris O'Clair. She's pleased to serve King County Metro as director of the Mobility Division, which ensures that customers can easily access and use Metro's transportation services, pay their fare, and utilize the region's system of public transit options. Her division director role is to oversee the planning for the fixed route system and the integration of all modes of transportation, ridership growth, and development of new mobility markets. She also oversees the customer services for Metro's full suite of mobility solutions and the delivery of all contracted transportation services, including the Access Paratransit service and the nation's largest van pool program. Chris is uniquely positioned to lead the agency's mobility transformation, advancing social equity, universal accessibility, and engaging people to travel farther, faster, and more easily throughout King County, Washington. Our next guest is Shane Phillips, and Shane manages the UCLA Lewis Center Housing Initiative, where he develops research, policy, reform, and educational materials to improve the public's understanding of housing markets and policies. He co-hosts the UCLA Housing Voice podcast and previously taught as an adjunct instructor at USC and worked as policy director for Central City Association, a downtown LA advocacy organization. He's also the author of The Affordable City, which argues for a multi-pronged approach to housing that addresses housing supply, stability, and subsidies. Shane has written for the Los Angeles Times, Atlantic, and other local and national outlets, and occasionally publishes at his blog, Better Institutions. And then our final guest, local Selena Barajas, is a native Tucsonan alum from both Sunnyside and Tucson Unified School Districts and the University of Arizona. She holds a master's degree in urban planning from UCLA and has experience advocating for social, cultural, and economic development initiatives for the community. While in Los Angeles, Selena worked for both the nonprofit and government sector and enjoyed planning events and festivals with the Pico neighborhood of Santa Monica and city of Inglewood. Now residing back in her hometown with her family, Selena has worked on transportation and mobility projects such as the 12th Avenue Street Improvement Project, Proposition 407 bicycle boulevards on Tucson South Side, the Move Tucson Initiative, and currently Tucson Norte Sur. Selena serves as the lead community ambassador, working alongside 13 community ambassadors and Tucson communities to identify opportunities for equitable reinvestment and access along the future 15-mile-long north-south high-capacity transit. The corridor connecting the Tucson Mall on the north side to downtown Tucson and to the Tucson Airport on the south side. It remains a top priority for Selena to promote and support local businesses, creatives, and makers, especially those who traditionally are undervalued. In addition to her equitable community development work, she is the co-founder of Avenidas Inc., a registered 501c3 nonprofit committed to catalyzing empowerment, inspiration, and economic development for the surrounding South Tucson community and beyond. Avenidas Inc. celebrates culture through economic redevelopment and reinvestment. In her free time, you can catch Selena cruising the streets of Tucson, reimagining vacant spaces, admiring local murals, all with a cafecito in hand. Me too. No, I'm coming along for the ride. So I'd like to open it up to the panelists to talk about their perspectives on this intersectional topic. And Chris, we'd like to start with you.
Good afternoon, Chris O'Clair, and I'm from King County Metro, which I'm just going to say is the Seattle region. And I look forward to coming to Tucson and spending some time with Selena. It's so wonderful to be here today with the panelists, and it's so wonderful to be here with all of you. I just want to ground us in who we are, King County Metro. We are were pre-COVID, the 7th largest transit agency, bus transit agency in the country. But we also do so much more. And I think that's really what I want to center you on here is we are a mobility agency, and we believe that mobility is a human right. So you're going to hear that theme throughout my speaking points today. And I'm sure hear that through many of my co-panelists. So what does that mean? First off, let's break down mobility. In order for people to move and have the freedom to move and have the freedom to get to new opportunities and to really progress in their life, we believe that whether it's a fixed route large bus or whether it's an on-demand service or whether it's even just safe, walkable, livable neighborhoods, that's a human right in the same way as so many other services are from the public sector. In doing that, we, in 2019, King County Metro, decided to change the way we do business, and we started our work a little bit differently. We started our Mobility Equity Cabinet, where we brought 25 community leaders representing low-income communities, minorities, Black, Indigenous, communities of color, immigrants, refugees, limited-speaking people, and people with disabilities together, and we paid them because their expertise was critical. They understood their communities, they represented their communities, and they were members of the community. We paid them to help us recenter our policies. We are now centered around a mobility framework that I believe we're going to have posted on, I think, the SharePoint later today, that really changed the way we do business. It's centered everything we do around equity, sustainability, and you can't forget safety. Because if the system is not safe, if the community is not safe, then we cannot all live, work, and play. In doing this, it really changed the way we look at not just how we make our decisions, but how we center our policies. And we adopted a new long-range plan and service guidelines. And this was all happening pre-pandemic. So this started in about 2018, 2019, but we were able to carry this work out and really be able to think about us not building a system for the middle, but us building the system for the margins. And if you do that, you bring everyone along. And that's the real definition of equity. It's not equality here. We're talking equity. We're trying elevating people who really need us most and delivering things different. Through the pandemic, we were the first place in the United States to have a known COVID case that was operating on our system, and we transformed immediately. We did things that many agencies already do, such as food delivery, move into vaccinations, et cetera, really being a mobility agency. But what we also found out is who needed us most were showing up through the pandemic. Those frontline workers, the essential workers, the people that were truly dependent on public transportation. And I think it's really important. We learned we are merely the caretakers of the system, and we are here really to deliver for those who need us most. In doing this today, I'll talk more about our mobility equity framework. I'll talk more about our tools that we're using, but I just want to center us that one of the things I want to share with Tucson and with the nation is most important is no matter who you are, you need to have fast, reliable, safe transit service. And I know that the city of Tucson is looking at what that means in a certain corridor and how to build that out. Do you look at a streetcar? Do you look at BRT? I think the most important thing to note is making sure you have the amenities so people can access the system, so people can connect to the system, so people can have real-time information, so it's clean and safe, so they can be able to feel sheltered and comfortable. And then I like to call it a show up and go network, where they can just show up and they don't actually need a schedule. They know it's going to come. It might be an on-demand service. It might be a small shuttle, or it might be a big fixed route BRT bus rapid transit system. A couple examples I just want to point out around the country is that in Eugene, they have a really good BRT system. And what they found is that they not only found an increase in ridership and travel times, but there was also impact on real poverty levels. If you make these investments in communities that need you most, and if you make them right, that we'll talk about today around land use and making it so communities can connect to the system, you can have real impacts. The other one I want to highlight for a BRT system is Cleveland. Cleveland does a wonderful job in looking at what they call their Healthline BRT system. And I think it's really important that As I said, the travel times are reduced, the people are showing up, but they're also finding a change in the economy. And that for every dollar they put in, they had a return on investment of $190 per dollar spent on this transit system. So real investments that we're going to talk about in land use and transportation come back in the economy. So I'm just going to wrap up this kickoff by saying, we at King County Metro believe in improving the quality of life. And that means no longer just measuring ridership. It means measuring things such as a sustainable environment, a thriving economy, and finally, healthy communities. And that is what we're about in really looking at providing mobility in King County. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Yay, we're excited to have you here. All right, now I'm going to toss it off over to Shane and go ahead and give your intro.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm actually originally from Seattle, so King County Metro is very familiar to me. I haven't been on the bus up there in a while, but I do miss it. So I just want to say two kind of general things about, I'm going to focus on housing because that's really my area of expertise, but I do think some of this would apply outside of it for sure. So first is that on the housing policy side, housing policy is complicated and there are a lot of inputs and outputs that interact with each other in complex ways. So to state, I think what is obvious, there is no silver bullet. That's something I feel like always has to be stated when we're talking about housing. In my book, I advocate for what I call a 3S approach to housing, one that co-prioritizes the need for a growing supply of homes, policies to provide people with stability and security in their homes and in their communities, and then subsidies to help people who the market just isn't going to serve or isn't going to serve adequately, at least. These things all link together. And if you pursue a housing policy agenda that doesn't address all of them, you're going to fall short and a lot of people are going to be hurt. Just as an example, if you want to enact some kind of rent stabilization, for example, which I do generally recommend, you need to think about how that policy relates to housing supply. If you get it wrong, you can really have a negative impact on the production of new homes and the availability of older rental homes that will drive up prices. But with some very simple tweaks, including a policy of, for example, exempting new buildings from the program until they turn 20 years old after they open their doors, you can get the vast majority of the stabilizing benefits of something like rent stabilization without nearly as much downside as rent control tends to be associated with in the academic literature and elsewhere. That's an example of taking supply goals seriously, even as you work more directly to improve stability. I don't want to get hung up with multiple examples here, but just suffice it to say that just as stability policies affect supply policies also affect stability policies. And we need to be mindful of how all of these intersections exist in our work and not get stuck in just one silo, whether that's within housing or between housing, transportation, sustainability, and so forth. The second thing I wanted to say is that we need to do, and I kind of heard this from Claire a little bit, like we need to do real planning, which is a slogan of a former planning director here in Los Angeles, Gail Goldberg. The way we usually do things now, we spend a year or more, maybe many more than 1 year, on community plans or housing elements and these other planning exercises, hopefully engaging as many people and as diverse a set of people as possible. And then we mostly ignore all the time and effort those people put into it. We use those planning processes so that we can say, here is what's legal to build on each parcel. And then when a developer arrives with a proposal that complies with those plans to the letter, we start a negotiation process for that specific project based on the demands of whoever happens to show up to a Tuesday evening meeting at City Hall. My colleague, Mike Manville, calls this protectual zoning, which basically means we create development rules only to bargain them away. And aside from being a huge waste of time and money on both the public and private side, it's also terrible for building trust in the planning process, and it's an open door to favoritism and an outright corruption. Doing real planning means engaging people early and extensively and as representatively as possible, developing a vision for an entire community or an entire city, not just an individual parcel or project, and a vision that, you know, balances many different interests, and then actually sticking to that plan. Most of the resources we devote to public hearings for individual projects would be much better spent on that community vision process to make it as inclusive and equitable and just widespread as possible. And if we do that, we'll find that we can ask just as much from developers. We'll just be doing it in an upfront and consistent way. And we'll be able to deliver new housing faster and at lower prices. And we'll have a community planning process that people can actually trust in, which, you know, to the topic here today, I think really has to be the foundation for any efforts to improve our cities and to do so in an equitable way. So I'll pass it on to the next panelist for here and wait for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane. Yeah. Selena, go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you for that introduction to Sarah and Chris, for sure. When you come to Tucson, we'll go have a couple shots of espresso. But yeah, here, you know, in Tucson with our Avenidas nonprofit, we really wanted to look at it through a cultural lens, the street view, and connecting the city of South Tucson with the city of Tucson, two jurisdictions along the same street, South 4th Avenue. And with my background of, you know, urban planning and doing all these transportation outreach initiatives, we came together to kind of just get us all in the same framework of, one, to build awareness, but also to get folks to help guide, I guess, these initiatives that the city or other agencies do take, you know, into our community. So when we started Avenidas, it was really interesting, and I was laughing this morning because, you know, transportation wasn't really my forte, especially in grad school. I was sharing with the group before this session of how, when I would sign up for classes, I would look at transportation at the bottom of my class list, just because historically, you know, transportation has come through a very white male perspective. And I couldn't connect with a lot of the theory. But now, today, I'm excited to say I love transportation and mobility initiatives. I think it's really important for our local Tucson community, especially when we're doing outreach like this Norte Sur project, of making it more relevant and not only accessible, but have them help guide the process. So that's what we've been doing with Avenidas, and looking at how our community could help guide the transportation and mobility issues that are arising between two jurisdictions. You know, historically, City of South Tucson has been a more financial need city. However, it's really rich with culture and history. So we've been really trying to emphasize that reinvestment piece of going back into this intergenerational community, of going back and giving back either monetary, through volunteer initiatives, and also how to be social, you know, post-pandemic era, and just how to make these streets a little bit more vibrant, but also safe, walkable, and accessible. And when we started Avenidas, I will tell you all, our push was the streetlights. You could see from one street to the next where the streetlights stop in the city of South Tucson. So when the city, or, you know, anyone wants to put in these mobility projects and advocate for more walkable, safe neighborhoods, we also have to look at the holistic, you know, out layers of one, is it safe to walk these streets when we're investing in so much, you know, money into protected bike boulevards, into sidewalks, into, you know, a BRT. Like, we have to also look at what that looks like. I know the session earlier was talking a little bit about that on 10th Avenue. So with Avenidas, we wanted to be out in the forefront to get folks to reinvest and look at it through a cultural lens.
Very great. Very excited to have all three of you here to kind of keep diving into this discussion. So the first question that I want to start with is, intersectionality is a theme in this session. Where do you picture the points of intersection between transportation, housing, and real planning, quote unquote, and sustainability. I'll kick it off to Chris maybe to start this round.
I really appreciate this question, and I think you're hearing it from different perspectives of all of us. But you said, I think transportation, planning and development, and really what the heart of this is community and culture. I mean, that's what keeps us together. We are human beings that need to be with each other, and that is at the core of what we believe in. And so looking at that, I just want to stress, we no longer call it transit-oriented development in King County. We call it transit-oriented communities, because really what you're building is not just a building that's mixed use, you're building where people live and where people connect and where people kind of move. And so I think that intersectionality is really, really critical. I'm going to highlight a couple of things, and I can't say it better than Shane did it. You're a true expert in your field, but that idea that when you're doing this, you can't do it at a micro scale. You have to do it along the entire vision. And if you do, you're just going to move. You're just going to do what we're doing with the suburbanization of poverty when what we're dealing with gentrification is that we really have to look at our region together and how we're going to build an affordable system that everyone can live, work, and play in. And I think if we do it at a corridor micro level, we've not only just misstepped with land use and transportation, but we've misstepped with the entire community on how we're going to do it together. The second thing that you heard from all of us is the involvement of community early, valuing community in their expertise, paying them to participate, understanding their time limitations and connectivity. And then, as Shane said, not just on that micro corridor, but in the entire vision of where we want to go together. And then the third thing I just want to highlight here is, there's a world that I always wonder, we just, are receiving some more federal funds as a transit agency, but wouldn't it be wonderful if we could truly align this local, state, and federal government dollars so that we're not just investing in transit on this corridor, but that we're also getting investments in affordable housing, investments in livable, walkable neighborhoods with the jurisdictions put in, and investments in art and culture for the communities. So how do we find ways, and this is what we're working hard in as we're looking at electrifying our system and really building it where it needs our greatest, where we have the largest emissions output that are hurting communities, but bringing in affordable jobs, bringing in community centers in some of these bases. How do we bring those resources together across some of these government subsidies? And that is, I think, one of the largest challenges we're facing right now. But I will say, COVID has broken down some of those walls. And some of these injustices and the reckoning that we need to do, and some of what we've done to our communities is beginning to break down so that we government agencies can work together and leverage resources together.
I can jump in and just add, really quickly on the planning side and the engagement side. I've been thinking a lot lately about this project right outside Union Station in Los Angeles, which is our transit hub. And it's called like the Union Station Promenade or something. It's a pretty, it's an interesting project. It's sort of pedestrianizing a little bit. And it has been in the planning process for something like 8 years now. The last time I went to a meeting for it was in, I think, 2016 or 17. It has been redesigned multiple times. I am much more engaged than just about anyone else in this city. Most people don't have, it's not their job to show up to these, so they can't show up to them all the time. And I've given up. I just am not interested. I am not following it anymore. They have lost me. And if they've lost me, they've lost just about everyone. And so there is value in not just doing that outreach and doing it really comprehensively, but then pulling the trigger, like actually moving forward once you've made a plan, rather than planning and planning and planning to the point where the people who showed up for the first meeting moved away 6 years ago, And so that's kind of one thing. On the intersections of all of this, it's funny that Chris mentioned the name transit-oriented communities rather than transit-oriented development, because Los Angeles has a program called transit-oriented communities that sort of came about as a result of a ballot initiative. And it's sort of a super density bonus, but it's very intersectional in that it is a density bonus and a floor area bonus and a parking reduction and a height increase, specifically in locations adjacent to high quality transit. And the better the transit, the more bonuses you get. In exchange for those bonuses, you do have to provide below market housing on site. But it all kind of is of a piece where you're getting more units, both income restricted and non-restricted. You're getting more housing specifically next to transit. And again, more kind of benefits near the highest quality transit that people are probably most likely to use. And less parking and these other things that are good for sustainability and saving people money as well. And you can juxtapose that kind of approach to something like just kind of traditional sprawl development, where it's relatively inexpensive, at least to the buyer or renter at the time of purchase. But there are all these long-term costs to in terms of their commute. So just the financial cost and their health cost. There's the obvious sustainability benefits in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and other things. And so I think juxtaposing those two things is helpful. And it's really encouraging seeing many cities moving in this direction of tying these things together and trying to achieve not just, say, housing affordability with their land use policies, but also these complementary goals of mobility and sustainability, among other things.
Yeah, and kind of tying back onto into Shane's point about the planning process, I think our community is constantly changing, right, in terms of just the landscape and demographics. So in 2016, that downtown LA area is probably way different. I mean, I know it's way different than in 2022 of what, that original plan probably was. But I think at the end, right, our community, we want a place of belonging. We want to be able, I know the mayor spoke about this morning, about having a place at the table and hearing the voices. So I think that's really important during this planning process, to be super transparent that how long it can take and how realistically the vision might not be the original vision, or else our community will hold these organizations, these agencies accountable when at the end result there isn't affordable housing, X amount of units along a certain projected plan. So I think that's very important when we're looking at the planning process, of just the transparency and the authenticity of it, of who's voicing and who's executing these renderings, these designs, and how that's being displayed is very important. I was listening to Shane's podcast, the UCLA Housing Voice, specific episode of transit induced displacement, and listening to that episode was very informative of thinking here in Tucson with this ETOD, this North to Sur project, of the folks that we're outreaching to today are not going to be this, it might not be the same communities in X amount of years, and we don't know how to track that data. Like, I was listening to that episode and they were saying, the guest you had on, Shane, said, we don't know if the train or the trolley was the indicator of why this house moved out into the suburbs or to another core area. So that's really really important for us to, one, just again, transparent, consistency, and also tracking those narratives throughout the years, but not prolonging it, because folks do get frustrated. And then at the end, it's just like a whole new demographic that you're going to be outreaching to. And it's just who benefits from these projects, who's going to be at stake from these projects, and also including, right, when you do want to do these projects on any type of scale, investing in those that are along this projected plan. So if that's connecting to the businesses, the community centers, the entrepreneurs, the formal and informal businesses, and those families that traditionally aren't along for the ride, I think is very transformative when thinking about, equity and transportation issues.
Those are really great responses. And I think ultimately why we are all in this is because we believe in all of these things and we're all good at our one kind of component. But I think the the four of us in here right now definitely see the value of these all coming together, because you can't do it in silos. So I love being a part of this panel with a broad perspective. So I'm gonna go to a question a little more specific towards how does transit-oriented development, but I really like changing that name, as Chris mentioned, and calling it transit-oriented communities. How do those affect housing affordability? And do you see speculation in the process helping or hindering? And what do you see as examples of this working in the past? And I might start with Shane first this time around.
Sure. So, I mean, there's a lot of directions I could go with this. I'll try to be brief here. I mean, I think the short answer is that it absolutely helps. My understanding of the research on housing production and supply is that honestly, just about everything helps. Different things help more or less, but housing is housing by and large. And, especially what I always try to push back against is this idea that it's sort of below market versus market rate, or non-market versus market. And the reality is almost everywhere needs a lot more of both. And building more market rate housing is not a barrier to building more below market housing. The barrier to building more below market housing is just funding, because it's expensive. And so that's one aspect of this, is like, the more we can build near transit, the better off we'll be. The reality is that there's some good research showing that this is actually LA-based research, but I think it's probably, you could extend it beyond that. Lower income people who live near transit, this is after actually one of our light rail lines opened, they use transit more. Like their transit use increases more than other groups, higher income groups. But at the same time, the vehicle miles traveled of higher income groups decreases more than for low income households. And so there is a benefit in either case. In the case of low income households, it's they're taking transit more. In the case of high income, it's they're driving less. And both of those things are really important. And so again, this idea that it's sort of below market versus market rate, or low income versus high income, we really need to make room for everyone in our cities. And the nice thing about the market rate stuff is we can just let people with their own private money build it, and other people with their own private money will rent or buy it. And that doesn't take anything away from our opportunities to fund below market housing for lower income households. So I think, other than that, maybe I'll stop there and we can go around the group and I can come back if there's more to add.
I mean, I think it's helping or hindering. I think it's going to rely really on the incentives of what's going to be the policy in place to not just protect, but also cultivate what's existing. So if it's like businesses that have been along a certain route for 40 plus years, and then they're going to have to experience the construction and the phase and the whole timeline of the end result. The incentives piece of incentives, providing incentives for the existing homeowners, but also potential homeowners, rent control, just thinking of the long term of what this can result and how the communities can shift if there aren't any incentives. So it's like, it's just like the G word, gentrification. Will it resolve gentrification? It can, absolutely. Can it also provide some incentives to provide an economic boost for an area that has historically not seen, vibrancy in terms of financial stability? You really have to think of who's at stake and who's in, I guess, who has the ball in their court, and who's gonna also be held accountable for providing these, for helping folks get their homes in a stable condition.
I did want to add, because this is one thing I left out of my introduction. The flip side, I talked about how, revising a stability policy can make a supply, work better. as I said, the reverse is also true. And so when we think about, well, we want to build more housing near transit, we also need to take into account the existing communities and stabilizing and security for them. Accepting that, like, maybe you have to tear some things down sometimes to build bigger and better, but you have to also make sure you're taking care of the people who live there now. And I think generally, when we decide, we need to make more room for more families and more households, you can either do that, and this is the way we've traditionally done that, by upzoning where you already have multifamily housing because it's easy, because there's less opposition to it there. But you're going to get a lot more displacement that way. You're going to have to tear down a lot more homes where people already live and where the density might already be pretty decent. And you always have the option instead to change the zoning where it's mostly owner-occupied housing, probably mostly single unit detached homes. You could change the zoning to allow housing in commercial corridors and areas, to sort of do more mixed use. So we have these options, and we've taken the politically easy one for a long time, and then we blame, new housing for gentrification, when in reality it's our choice to protect, the 80 or 90% of land in most cities that is zoned only for single unit detached homes and nothing else, which, a large share of the population cannot and increasingly will not be able to afford. And so again, I think thinking about how these things relate to each other, and not just thinking about it in terms of how do we get more supply near transit, but also how do we do that in a way that is respecting people's security and the dignity of their housing situations.
Can I also include with Avenidas, we've been looking at obviously the housing, like trying to talk to these neighbors specifically in South Tucson on getting them to start talking about family estate planning, and how that looks when, with their grandchildren and keeping that house in family under that umbrella, but also looking at the current existing commercial developers along this specific street and telling them, they're all getting older, they all might want to close up shop, but letting them know, hey, when you're ready to close your doors, when you're ready to sell this building, let's sell within, this neighborhood. Let's try to really promote selling back local, instead of a big developer coming in with cash. Let's try to really support the local businesses, the existing businesses, to want to come in and keep that, the vibrancy of this corridor similar, but also understand that there's going to be a new generation coming in too. So we've been having a lot of talks around that.
I'm just going to support what you guys are saying. I think I come from the other angle of when you bring transit into a corridor, being really intentional about planning to include multiple types of housing options and subsidized housing options, as you're talking about, Shane. And I think, as you said, Selena, really focusing on cultivating the existing. I'm just going to be a fact. If it's not done well, it's going to hinder, right? And if it's not coordinated well, it will have negative effects. And we've seen that throughout this country, but we also have excellent examples as how it's helped. Housing costs and transportation costs are really the cost of living for most people. And so the more we can do to really make sure, as we bring in transit investments, we know they create great public spaces, great transit system, vibrant communities, but and it creates demand and access, but it does make them more expensive over time. And so how do we do that while protecting those, so they can have everyone can have access to that? That's the biggest challenge at hand. And to keep our costs, and for us as a transit agency, we have subsidized smart card systems that we give at different levels, and we believe in a fair payment system that's completely income-based. So as you're the developer working with affordability, you also need to work with your transit agency and say, you also have to make the system affordable so everyone can have access to the system.
That's really great. I'm gonna kind of tie it. I mean, I think all of our questions are all blurring together in a sense because of the like overarching multifacetedness of this topic. But the next question that I want to dive into is what are planning initiatives like code changes or incentives that could assist with more equitable transportation? So what Chris, you had just mentioned, you know, kind of that card that you use, also including with housing and land use. So I picture it always as the toolbox, and what kind of tools can we place into the toolbox to do all of the things. And I'm also going to tie this in with a question that came in from the chat as well. So Chris had mentioned your agency being able to pay people to serve on the equity committee as the government agency. So first off, what are tools that we can put into the toolbox to use to make our communities more equitable and housing affordable and all of the things? And Chris kind of making a more specific question on what advice do you give to staff to make it possible to pay people to participate in these systems?
Great, I'll try to do this. It's a big question. I just want to start off with the tools, and I'm going to start, you know, when we're working with developers, we're looking at lowering our parking requirements, and, you know, parking's expensive when you build development, especially structured parking. So we built a right-sized parking tool in King County, and we're working with local land use developers. We're also trying to incentivize people to buy into our Orca system into monthly passes. So instead of, as you move into a development, instead of getting a parking spot, here's your bus pass. And we are incentivizing and subsidizing those of lower income. So I think that's really important, getting the transit agency to come in and help with that, and really bringing the tools in associated with that. We have lots of different tools at that kind of minute level and looking at working with developers, but I just want to back up and give you what we do as a tool overall. We have something called our Equity Impact Review, and I think many other places around the country are doing this. There are many models out there, but I just want to just highlight this. This is the tool that, whether you're making a decision and working with development around transit, or you're choosing your next BRT line, or even making a simple decision on how you're going to invest to build a better fair payment structure, you need to look differently at how you're making those decisions. And we have 5 phases that we go through. A scoping phase, where we're really looking at the demographics, who's coming to the table, who has a voice, assessing equity in the community context. What are the outcomes we're looking for as a community? Not just ridership, not just number of affordable housing. What are the outcomes you want? And how do we measure that? Because that's hard. Investing in qualitative, not just quantitative information, focus groups, discussions is a lot of money. I'll talk to you about that at the end. Looking at analysis and decision-making. So your decision makers are grounded in this process. So they know that the traditional ways in which you're going to measure this, the costs and the benefits are different. Getting them involved in this equity review, because that decision needs to come from the ground up. Then the implementation, which I think is important, is that we're really advancing and looking at contracting and hiring with a pro-equity. This is really critical, that we really involve the community also in the implementation of who's going to deliver this. And then finally, I always want to state this, that government is really trying to do well, is that ongoing learning. You don't just build a project and walk away. The best projects are, what did we learn from this? How can we revisit this? That plan, do, check, adjust model is so critical in this equity impact. And then we take that and we adjust our tool. This is something critical for every decision. We just went through our budgeting process, and all of us had to put our policies in forefront and our equity impact reviews in order to do it. That takes time. So that gets to the question that I saw on the panel, is how do you pay for this? And I'm going to say, we pay for it because we know that we are really the caretakers of the system, but really the people that need to make the decisions are the people that live and breathe and use it. Those are the taxpayers. Those are the community. Those are the people that need us. So if you aren't paying them to participate, what is my expertise at the end of the day? You know, so what, I have a master's in public policy. It doesn't matter if I'm not working and helping the community to get what they need. So we have put aside large amounts of money, and I will tell you that comes at the cost of service. It comes at the cost of real delivery of different things. It comes at the cost of even more staff within King County Metro. And that's hard. But what we know we need to do is we need to prioritize the voices. And the best way to do it is not just through these equity impact reviews, the equity cabinet, but every planning process, we now pay community-based organizations to participate.
I was going to let Selena go, but I'll go, I guess.
Thank you, Shane.
Yeah, go ahead. You go first, please.
No, I appreciate that, Chris, because I think it's really important that we know that our community are the, the value trusted partners, because not only are they from the areas that these initiatives are being, most impacted, but they're the ones that are going to be probably the most, vocal, and also it relates closer to them. It's deeper than just, something that they're going to see on a map. So I think that resonates into the overall project of the community at large, looking at them as the trusted partners, but also respecting the project a little bit earlier on, I guess. You don't have to explain it or try to, get a sway either way, because these community partners, these community-based organizations are the ones relaying, these plans. The other thing I was gonna say was, I think it's really important in this planning process to really focus on that community engagement early on, but also understand that it takes time. I was listening to you, Chris, speak and at a conference and talking about how one of your projects took 2 years to really get the community voice and their perspective. And I think that's really important, because when you rush a project, I mean, there's twofold, right? I know Shane was saying that that project is taking too long. There's a balance, but I think the community, they can feel either that urgency or almost like that pressure to participate, and it almost is like a turnoff, and vice versa. And also, if the project is taking too long, they're going to lose interest. So I think there really needs to be a balance of hearing from the community early on, and that would probably prevent, a lot of the roadblocks that we see later on in the process.
Selena, I think that, sorry, real quick, that time is so critical, and Shane, you're probably going to agree. And one of the things we have the hardest time doing is describing that to our electeds, right? Because people want to see results, right? Especially, and so that, I think, if I'm going to tell you guys what our biggest challenge is, we have bought into this, but really describing that time and that value of time to electeds is a challenge. Sorry, Shane.
No problem. So on the kind of specific policies, I already talked about the TOC program here in Los Angeles and how that sort of prioritized transit adjacent locations. And the strength of that is that it was the whole city. And so, something that I think is overlooked is we tend to do zoning reform kind of neighborhood by neighborhood or even parcel by parcel. And that's a great way of concentrating a lot of development all in one place very quickly, which is exactly what a lot of people don't want to happen. And I think understandably, I think Jane Jacobs described this as like cataclysmic development. We need to actually make capacity across our cities and across our neighborhoods so that no one neighborhood is sort of bearing the costs of that in terms of just, all the construction and everything else and just the rapid change. So I think spreading it around is really important. The flaw in the TOC program, or one of them, is that it is, because it's a density bonus, a 70% bonus to a parcel that only allows 1 unit still only allows 1 unit. And so we have train stations in the middle of the city that are surrounded by single unit detached homes on 6,000 square foot lots that are worth $1.5 million or $2 million each. And even if everyone that lived in those homes took the train every day, they'd add a few hundred rides to the system because it's just so low density. And I can tell you most of them are not taking the train. And so that's a big part of this. And I think, another shortcoming of the TOC program and is there are no displacement protections or mitigations. And so again, it's really relying on building higher density in already multifamily zones. And sometimes there are single unit homes that are being torn down because they've just been there for forever. And so we're kind of getting the housing to match the zoning, and that's great. But a lot of times it is multifamily. And as I said, in any built out city, you have to tear things down to build bigger and better. And there's no real avoiding that. But there are things you can do to minimize that as much as possible by allowing more homes in other places. And then two, or B, I don't know which number system I use there, is making sure that there's some kind of displacement mitigations, if not outright prohibitions. So if you accept that, sometimes you're going to have to tear things down, you at least need to be able to offer, a negotiated buyout for the tenant or allow them to return to the new building at their previous rent, those kinds of options. And again, to tie this back to the sort of intersectionality between different goals, those are expensive things to do. And if your zoning is only allowing you to replace a 3-unit building with a 6-unit building, it is not going to be financially feasible to offer all of the previous tenants a below market unit in the new building. But that's sort of the point, is that that's just not a worthwhile redevelopment. We don't want to be tearing down 3 units to build 6. We want to be tearing down 3 units to build 30 or more. And so, that project that might have happened prior with these displacement protections, now it's not going to happen. And that's in a sense bad because we need more homes, but you could just allow more density somewhere else where those kinds of impacts are not going to happen. So again, it's really important that if you're going to strengthen protections, which we should, you need to offset that by allowing more homes and working on the sort of zoning side at the same time. And I think that's just really important to keep in mind.
Well, thank you so much, Shane. And we will have to continue this at another time. Of course, our time is up and we didn't get to all of our questions, but constantly think about what equity is and what diversity is in all of these spaces. And I think as we continue on, we keep that in our mind. Thank you all so much. Stick around for the closing post summit discussion with Ben and his big papa, the great Albert Elias. Hopefully we will see you guys all in that next session. And once again, thank you to this panel for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.